The popular Nickelodeon. Despite efforts of businessmen to end existence of the 5-cent theater, it still lives and prospers because of popularity. From Moving Picture World, January 18, 1908, by Frederick J. Haskin. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The efforts of merchants in Philadelphia and other cities to put a stop to the moving picture shows may find hearty response among businessmen, but the great majority is on the side of the Nickelodeon. Philadelphia uses law processes, Louisville uses fine regulations, other cities employ other means to end the existence of the 5-cent theater, but it still lives and prospers, financial panics notwithstanding. The Nickelodeon came to answer a demand for short, cheap, wholesome entertainment, and passed quickly from the list of novelties into that of standard amusements. Its home is a small hall that will seat a few hundred people, for if too great a crowd is admitted, the amusement transcends its privileges and is raised to the rank of a theater and must pay a theater license instead of an amusement license. The hall is fitted with a small stage that supports a screen for the pictures, while a piano or performerless musical apparatus beats out an accompaniment to the comedy or tragedy being portrayed by the moving pictures. A 5-cent admission invites a patronage that would not be given anywhere else, and one may leave as early as one wishes or stay through the entire performance. The Nickelodeon was born in a little southern town and was the inspiration of a soda fountain man. This man had bought an expensive soda fountain and installed it in an old drugstore and soon found he was losing money. Just in the midst of the financial straits, his landlord came and offered him the next door building, also at a bargain figure. The building he already had did not seem to be paying, but as nothing could be worse than that one, he concluded he would take two. He cast about in his mind for some means of making it a paying thing, and just then when a maker of moving pictures came by, he found his solution. The picture maker had not been so successful himself. They decided to open a small theater that would seat 100 people and entertain them by throwing moving pictures on a screen and have a graphophone make music at the same time. They at first charged 10 cents admission, then they saw that half as much would be more popular and profitable. The Nickelodeon was a success from the start. At the end of 8 or 9 months, the soda fountain man and the moving picture maker had $35,000 in the bank of the small town and were well on the highway to success. Their idea was soon flying far and wide over the country. Big cities and little ones took it up until there are 5,000 or over in full swing throughout the country, with many hundred in New York alone. Some have even gone so far as to enlarge their houses and take out regular theater licenses at $500 a year, so they can accommodate the 800 or 1,000 people that their gatemen have showed would be possible if the auditoriums were large enough. Philadelphia alone has one that clears upwards of $30,000 a year, and this after one considers the fact that the average attendance of the smallest ones must average 4,000 a week, at least, to meet the running expenses. New York's great trouble has been that the noise of the barkers' megaphones and phonographs at the entrances cause annoyance, and formal complaints have been filed against the Nickelodeons by merchants of their neighborhoods. As a result, the barker may go, but the phonograph, under one of its many guises, may remain, for, in this age of machinery that must soon minimize man's services in many ways, even as a mechanism throws the figures of the actors and actresses on the canvas in the darkened rooms where owl-eyed ushers skillfully find you a seat, so it must eventually furnish the entrance calls, the urgent invitations to come and see what is inside, and all the gay music that sets you to wondering what lies beyond the doors. Children are the best patrons of the Nickelodeon. The 5-cent piece is easily begged from the parental purse, and thousands of tots go to the tiny moving picture show who never see any other. To meet their demands, real fairy tales are often enacted and bits of travel and history shown. In large cities where a new foreign population helps swell the census rolls, an astonishingly large percentage of the audience in the Nickelodeon is drawn from the Latin races who cannot speak English, who could not understand a word of an English play, but who can understand and enjoy a picture pantomime. Romance finds its adherents the world over, whether one understands the language of a country or not, and the tragedies of a Watteau shepherdess, posed perhaps in some modern wood just outside Paris where real sheep are available, are quite real to the audience of a New York East Side Nickelodeon, whether they are mentally interpreted in Yiddish, Italian, Bohemian, Syrian, or Polish. The blunders of the tipsy man with the accommodating latchkey are understandable in any language when only a picture portrays them, and the tragic story of the forsaken wife and the dying child are as real can be, and sympathetic sniffles and visible applications of handkerchiefs bear flattering tribute to the faraway actors in some moving picture studio who acted out the touching little drama before the powerful camera. The Nickelodeon, in its demand for many and varied pictures, has created, in the 5 years of its existence, a new class of actors and a new class of playwrights. Actors who never more see a real stage, who are ever far away from real footlights, and who never hear the plaudits of the millions they please by their art, play out in pantomime before the cameras the hundreds of little dramas that the moving picture machines, under their manifold names, present to audiences all over the world. Men who could not write a line of a play have become famous at making plots for the actors to interpret. The Nickelodeons use the majority of the films so prepared, and talent and ingenuity are busy keeping up the supply. It is no small task making these little photographic films of the modest proportions of 5/8 by 1 1/8 inches, but so many of them strung together that the whole is many hundred feet long. Large studios are fitted up as interiors, roof gardens and the tops of giant skyscrapers are pressed into service, and often the homes of the actors and actresses are used to give better effects when needed. Long excursions into the parks near Paris or New York are made with actors and actresses in costume ready to run automobiles, ride horseback, engage in some mirth-provoking chase, or act out simple tea party scenes as the needs of the play may be. When real pedestrian or disinterested parties of any sort sometimes cross the line of the camera at the critical minute, so much the better for the picture. It gives a greater reality. Busy thoroughfares, shady country lanes, and private gardens are all being pressed into service today by the enterprising maker of pictures for the 5-cent theater, and every device that science can bring him is pressed into service. Sometimes the process is slow and the work is expensive. There are freak pictures where giant knives rush out and slice bread unaided. With a few jerks and amid much laughter and speculation, the incident is over in a few seconds. Yet it took many days to make that film, for the knife was moved ever so tiny a distance and photographed, then moved and photographed again, and yet again, until the entire film has received its impressions, and when rapidly reeled off, gave the desired effect that 1,000 exposures had been necessary to produce. Sometimes the scenes to be reproduced are miles apart. The critical audience in the little Nickelodeon may discover too crude attempts at deception, and so natural settings must be procured if possible. cabs hurtle down the Champs-Élysées for the benefit of the cameraman on the sidewalk. Accidents occur, and people are evidently injured as per schedule. Accommodating ditchers, comforted by substantial money, have been found who are willing to be knocked bodily into the holes they have dug, and then emerge covered with dirt and confusion for the benefit of the ready camera. Cowboys who never saw the plains have charged bravely through the Bronx to circumvent a mail coach robbery by a band of Indian braves borrowed from the Hippodrome, all under the camera's cyclopean eye. But when real Western scenes were needed to complete the pictures, the cameraman has bundled up his expensive instruments, his miles of delicate film, and, with a hurry-up order from the Nickelodeon managers in his pocket, has gone swiftly to the deserts of Arizona or the mesas of New Mexico. There he has pressed the real cowboy and the real Indian into service against the real background of endless plain and sapphire sky that can never be faked. The Nickelodeon audiences demand travel scenes. They must be had, and they must be filled with adventure and perhaps have a bit of romance tucked in between. For ever since time began, all the world has loved the lover and sympathized with him in his joys and sorrows. Real Alps are climbed, real deserts are crossed, real dangers encountered, actual conditions of heat and cold are endured, and more than once the forfeit of health or life has been paid that the baby theater may receive films that tell a good story and reproduce real conditions. The first moving picture was made in 1897, the Corbett Fitzsimmons fight in Carson City, when a film 7 miles long was used, and the men fought under several hundred powerful arc lights for the picture maker's benefit. Certain tricks of trade have been learned that make the pictures better every year. One rather expensive thing is the use of ground glass, only, when glass is to be shattered, for its edges photograph better. Talcum powder is always used to simulate smoke, for it does not dim the picture. With 2 million people already going every day to these tiny theaters, and more waiting to go, the maker of the show must keep a new and varied selection of pictures. The public has demanded pleasures in small and attractive packages, and he must continue to meet the demand. End of The Popular Nickelodeon, from Moving Picture World, January 18, 1908, by Frederick J. Haskin. Read by Andrea Kay.
The Process of Hat Making Explained, with Prefatory Remarks, etc., etc., by Robert Lloyd. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Turks are said to assign as a reason for not wearing hats that they are put together by witchcraft. There is certainly a great deal of ingenuity in the practice, and some effects produced whose causes as are yet unexplained. But with all due deference to these turbaned gentlemen, it is presumed that they have objections beyond what is above stated, some of which are as follows. First, their country is destitute of the most essential material, fur. Second, the climate being extremely sultry, stoves, irons, and scalding water are not likely to become favorites. Thirdly, being compelled by their religion to keep their heads close shaved, a hat, above all human inventions, would be the most ridiculous covering they could adopt. There are many opinions as to the time hats were first invented, and very probably all equally erroneous. Some carry the date as far back as the foundation of Christianity, attributing the merit to St. Luke, of whom it is said that he, having tender feet, put a layer of hair or fur between them and his sandals, in which situation friction and moisture caused such an interweaving of particles that the whole became strongly united, or, technically called, felted. Whether the story, as applied to Luke, be true or false is immaterial, but that such did happen with some one is very likely. Nor is it at all unlikely but that an occurrence of this kind did really give the first idea of hat making. Having remarked thus much, I shall next proceed to state what is not the less true than surprising, which is, that of the various branches of manufacture which this country is so highly distinguished for, none are less understood than hat making. Nay, there is not one person in 50 who, if he were asked the question, could tell whether a hat was or was not a woven substance, nor is there one in 500 but what suppose that the skin of a hare or rabbit is worked with the fur attached to it, as in the natural state, and to form a correct judgment of the external material when manufactured, whether it be hair, wool, or beaver, although many pretend, none are really competent but those experienced in the trade. To show the absurd notions some entertain on this matter, I state as a fact that I do not know a manufacturer or seller in the trade but what has been applied to by some one or other to have a beaver hat made from a hare's skin. Nay, I remember once offending a very good customer, and a man not wanting for sense either, by an involuntary burst of laughter, on his presenting the skin of a French lap dog for the very same purpose. It is no uncommon thing for persons who are on pretty good terms with their capabilities to give opinions as to the merits or demerits of a hat, which opinions are as opposite to the true state of the case as the sun's rays to the state of darkness. I shall give an instance, although a trifling one, of a very common error among persons who suppose themselves to have a knowledge of the subject, which is this: if the picker has not a very good eye, some of the larger hairs will be left in the hat, and consequently the most visible. These are directly termed grey hairs, when the truth is that they are the blackest in the whole composition, but being thicker than the general mass, they receive a greater portion of light, which is mistaken for a grey colour. An easy method of proving the fact is to pull one of these grey hairs from the hat, and place it on a piece of white paper. The contrast will decide the question. Again, whatever produces a glutinization of the nap is said to be the effect of the stiffening. This is not true in every case, for it is frequently owing to improper management in placing the hat, when wet, before a large fire, which should never be done. The better way is, if very wet, to hang it up without brushing or wiping, and when dry it is easily put to rights, by gently passing over a clothes brush. If only slightly wet, wipe it with a handkerchief, and when dry it will brush clean. But the great fault with most persons is to put on their hats day after day in the same dirty state as when taken off at night, from which it is natural to infer that there must be a vast accumulation of dirt. It is this dirt, when exposed to the rain, that forms a sort of cement or paste, having all the appearance of what is commonly called gum. Another proof of erroneous judgment. Profuse perspiration of the head is what many are subject to, by reason of which, from the frequency of wearing and the porosity of the hat, there is a continual absorption of moisture going on until it becomes completely saturated, particularly in the front. The consequence is that the nap lies buried in a greasy matter, which matter is also but very inappropriately termed gum or stiffening, when in point of fact it is neither, for the very same effect would, under the like circumstances, be produced, and in much less time, if the hat were not stiffened at all. The best remedy for this is a piece of thin flannel under the leather, and that frequently changed. There is nothing so detrimental to a hat as a severe exposure to rain on the first, second, or even third time of wearing. For this reason, the materials wherewith it is composed are in a manner quite green, and require seasoning, to effect which it should be frequently put on in dry weather. I have always found that a hat constantly worn for 5 or 6 weeks without being wet underwent every sort of hardship afterwards with little or no injury, retaining at the same time its beauty, form, and wearing 3 times longer than it otherwise would have done. It may be asked, why not, to prevent accidents, render the hat waterproof? That is, impervious to the action of either atmosphere or rain. The thing is easy enough, I admit, but where there is a choice of only 2 evils, it is always best to select the least. We all know, or should know, that if a man were to enclose himself, arms, legs, and body, in what is called an oilskin dress, and that drawn close round the neck, the whole tightly fitted to every part of his person as a hat is to the head, the most unpleasant consequences would ensue. The cause why is obviously this: the exhalations of the body, particularly in a state of exertion, would, when so enclosed, be either prevented from flying off, as nature requires, or otherwise checked altogether. Precisely so with the head, if the porosity of the hat was destroyed, which it must be to resist effectually the action of water. This deduction must be so clear and self-evident that further reasoning is unnecessary. Another great objection against waterproof hats is that the ingredients made use of for such purposes, when exposed to the sun's heat, are so acted upon as to cause a decomposition of the color, and 9 times in 10 the hat, before it is half worn out, becomes anything but what it was meant to be. It is astonishing to hear the number of qualifications a hat is said to have, and each as opposite to the other as it is possible for any 2 things to be. Some, for instance, maintain that it cannot be good unless it is light. Others again will decidedly condemn it for being so, insisting that the chief recommendation is its being firm and stout. All that is requisite to be observed on this is that weight has no more to do with the quality of a hat than the situation of prime minister has to do with the cramming of turkeys. A very inferior hat may be made equally light with the most superior, and in both cases the cost of manufacture will be less than if they were made stout. The length of the beaver, too, is another point on which the difference of opinion is often experienced. Many are for very short naps, declaring all others to be outrageously vulgar, but the majority of wearers seem best pleased with long naps, which always take and retain the best black, while on the contrary those that are very short never do. A medium between the 2 is the most preferable. Having stated thus much, I shall next proceed to explain in what way a fine hat is made, describing as accurately as possible the various processes it undergoes, as also the materials with which it is composed, the proportions of each, as well as the quantity of work a man is capable of doing, whether maker or finisher, in a week, the amount of wages, together with some of the curious regulations, by-laws, etc., etc., etc. In the first place, as I shall have occasion to mention a few of the implements by name, a short description of them may not be amiss. There is the bow, which in form is not unlike what is used for playing a double bass, but in length and thickness is equal to a constable's staff. There is a bridge at each end, from one to the other of which is tightly strung a stout line of catgut. The hurdle is situated in what is called the bow garret, and is a sort of table on which the fur is bowed or mixed, having the farther end and sides enclosed to prevent the material from being blown away. The battery is somewhat like the hopper of a mill. In this is contained the hot liquor, and is mostly constructed for 8 men, round which they stand when making. The lower part is lead, the upper or working part mahogany. All batteries are formed into divisions, called planks, one of which is allotted to each man. There are many other little things used by makers, but these 3 are all that deserve particular notice. The first thing a maker looks for in the morning is the fur, or raw material, which is furnished to him by weight, the quantity being more or less, according to the substance of the hat required, and is in 2 parcels, one of which contains the beaver, or napping, the other the body. A proportionate scale of both will be seen hereafter. Thus provided, he takes it to the bow garret. The materials for the body are first placed on the hurdle, and the bow being hung at the center for support, is held in the left hand horizontally so that the catgut may come in contact with the fur. In the right hand is placed a small piece of stick with a nut at the end, and in this position the work begins after the following manner. The catgut of the bow, being first placed in the midst of the fur, is pulled or struck with the knotted stick, which produces from a quick repetition of the stroke a continued vibration. This vibration it is that causes a separation or flitting of the fur, at the same time mixing and cleansing it. This operation is continued until such ends are fully attained. It is next divided into halves, one of which is laid aside, and the other again bowed over. In this second operation the workman contrives, partly by bowing and partly by a slight wicker frame, to bring the material into an oblong form, and equal in size to a larger sheet of cartridge paper. This is called a bat, and when done it is gently pressed down by the wicker, after which a damp linen cloth is laid all over, and on this again is placed a thick piece of dry horsehide. The workman now begins to press hard on the hide for about 5 minutes. In the doing this the fur adheres close to the damp cloth, into which it is doubled up, and once more undergoes the pressure of the hand. Under this operation, which is called basoning, the bat becomes consolidated, and may be thrown, when taken out of the cloth, from one end of the garret to the other without injury. The second half is next bowed, formed into a bat, and basoned as the first. This half remains on the hurdle, and a piece of paper, somewhat conical, is placed on it, over which, and agreeable to the shape, the sides of the bat are doubled. Here then is formed one half of the body. This is laid aside, and the first bat is then put flat on the hurdle on which the one previously doubled is placed, with its open part downwards. The lower bat, being transversely doubled over the top hat, forms a sort of conical or harlequin's cap. In this state it is once more put into the damp cloth, where it receives another hardening for the purpose of uniting or knitting both bats together. After this it is folded into the compass of 2 hands, ready for the plank. The next thing is the beaver, or covering, which is bowed in form to correspond with the body, but has nothing to do with it at this stage. Matters being completed thus far, this is called the first process of hat making. The second commences as follows. The workman, having gone from the bow garret to the making shop, takes his stand at the battery, under which is a fire, for the purpose of heating the liquor. Footnote: the liquor, which is always kept up to scalding heat, is nothing more than clean soft water, with a wine glass of vitriol, and a small quantity of beer dregs thrown in. The first is to shrink the body of the hat in working, the other to destroy the pernicious effects of the vitriol. End footnote. Into this hot liquor the body is quickly immersed, where it remains till soaked through. It is afterwards laid on the plank to drain and cool. This done, it is unfolded, gently rolled, turned at short intervals in every direction to prevent the sides uniting together, and as the liquor becomes cold and rolled out, it is continually supplied with hot and fresh, by the sprinkling of a brush, which is dipped in a kettle for that purpose. Under this operation, assisted by the astringency of the vitriol, the body shrinks, and begins to assume a tough substance. When it has shrunk to a certain size, say 3/5 if to be double covered, it is laid flat on the plank, and the first coat of beaver, as it comes from the bow, is laid quite over it. The brush is now dipped into the hot liquor, the contents of which is sprinkled all over the beaver. Directly afterwards it is gently patted down with the hot brush. Here the body is put into a hair cloth, rolled in hot liquor, turned inside out, rolled again until the beaver is completely worked into the body. When this is effected, it is in a fit state to receive the second covering, which is put on as the first, the working, turning, patting, and rolling still continuing until it is reduced to a fit dimension, the beaver quite clean, and altogether assuming a closely felted, fine, solid piece of workmanship, after which it is immediately blocked in this same liquor to the size wanted and put into a stove to dry, from whence it is taken and with a small fine card the beaver is gently raised. Without this, one half would lie buried and the beauty lost. Here, then, is the complete process of hat making. It is next sent to the dyer, from whom it passes to the finisher, who, after stiffening, blocking, and half finishing, sends it to be picked, which is performed by a woman, whose place it is to pull out the kemps, or thick hairs, without injuring the beaver, although that is not always accomplished. Footnote: It has frequently been asked, why not make a hat with beaver only? The answer is, there is not sufficient stamina or strength in it to become a sound felted substance. It would be worse than building a brick house without mortar, or some sort of cement, to bind the whole together. End footnote. From the picker it returns to the finisher, who by the iron and velvet cushion gives it those highly brilliant and admired beauties that an English hat is so preeminently distinguished for. The shaper next takes it in hand, who is guided in his operations by the fancy of the wearer, if bespoke, which is sometimes a little whimsical. After shaping, it goes to the trimmer, from whom it is returned to the tipper off. He gets it ready for the wearing. It is then sent to its destination, when the master, if he is fortunate, puts the amount into his pocket. Footnote: Some have payment beforehand, which brings out the following old but very foolish saying: there are but two bad paymasters, he who pays beforehand, and he who never pays. How the latter can be a paymaster requires some little ingenuity to determine. End footnote. End of the process of hat making explained, with prefatory remarks, etc., etc., by Robert Lloyd. Read by Phil Schampf.
The Queen of Egyptology by William Copley Winslow. Amelia Blandford Edwards, the Honorary Secretary for Great Britain of the Egypt Exploration Fund, did her best and most enduring work as an Egyptologist. I use this still somewhat occult designation in a broad as well as a technical sense. Was she wonderfully versatile in various lines of intellectual labor? She was also many-sided as an Egyptologist. When she vividly painted the many prerequisites of the successful explorer in situ in one of her lectures, I inwardly said, "What a queen among explorers you would make!" As an incipient Egyptologist in 1874, she wriggled in through an aperture about 1.5 feet square in discoveries at Abu Simbel, so graphically told by her in Chapter 18 of 1,000 Miles Up the Nile. Yes, this woman, whose face graces this number of the American Antiquarian, born on June 7, 1831, and actually writing for a weekly journal an accepted poem in 1838, entitled The Knights of Old, at the age of 9, winning the prize for a temperance story, sending to George Cruikshank for the Omnibus in 1845 a tale with such deft caricature pencilings on the back of the manuscript as to inspire him to at once call on the rare unknown, to be greeted by a blooming maiden of but 14. This woman, who rang out musical notes with such flexibility and compass at the age of 20 that the opera would seem to be her destined profession, who was well known in 1853 as a contributor to periodical literature and as a full-blown novelist from then till 1864, when that still favorite romance, Barber's History, appeared, who in 1865 produced a little volume of ballads, and then in turn became a reviewer on the staff of the London Morning Post, Saturday Review, Graphic Illustrated News, and other journals, who as a traveler in 1873 prepared that spirited book on the Dolomite Mountains, with her own illustrations, Untrodden Peaks and Unfrequented Valleys, and who published in 1880 that combinative novel of travel, scenery, incident, society, and plot, Lord Brackenbury, translated into French, German, Italian, and Russian. This woman, I say, in entering the lists of Egyptology, must perforce be many-sided, prismatic, quick-sighted, and largely sympathetic. Miss Edwards knew Egypt personally, and its history completely. She mastered the literature of research and exploration, and caught the freshest news of every discovery. The late Sir Erasmus Wilson wrote me that she is in the advance of the advanced authorities upon the results of the latest discoveries. She was profoundly interested in whatever cast light on philological and ethnical questions, or that related to the arts or sciences of contemporaneous nations, and withal she had a fair or respectable knowledge of the hieroglyphic text. Her talents, tastes, previous training, studies in her adopted profession, eminently qualified her for the post of honorary secretary of the society which she, with Sir E. Wilson and Professor R. Stuart Poole, founded in 1883. Nay, was she not born to be an Egyptologist? For, as a child, she tells us, Wilkinson's manners and customs of the ancient Egyptians shared my affections with the Arabian Nights. I knew every one of the 600 illustrations by heart. Doubtless, too, her official position inspired her superabounding versatility to claim, "The boundless field is mine." So, by nature and by grace and otherwise, it came about that Miss Edwards was the best delineator that old Egypt has ever had. The Saturday Review thinks, "No other writer did so much to render Egypt popular. Hers was preeminently the role of interpreter." April 23. Her lectures to American audiences, in their substance and expressions, most happily established my claim. Her advent christening as an enthusiastic amateur in Egyptology may date from 1877, when 1,000 Miles Up the Nile appeared, and her confirmation in that science from 1881, when she had critically mastered all the details of the unprecedented discovery of the royal mummies at Thebes, and substantially assisted Sir E. Wilson in preparing his book, The Egypt of the Past, which she was revising the last year of her life. Harper's Magazine of July 1882, under the title Lying in State in Cairo, gives her clear, picturesque, delightful story anent these royal mummies. Both Lady Amelia, she was, by the way, maternally descended from the Walpoles, and Sir Erasmus afford an interesting parallel or coincidence. Late in the afternoon of life he took up the study of Egypt, preparing, as a result, the best work in its scope on ancient Egypt that I know of, already referred to, and she, a novelist and journalist, when entering upon middle age, giving the world a most captivating, inspiring, instructive book that has become, as a pocket edition, almost another Baedeker to the Nile tourist. One of Miss Edwards' pamphlets is in substance her paper read at the Congress of Orientalists, held at Leyden in 1884, entitled On a Fragment of a Mummy Case, illustrated by herself. Here I may exemplify the clearness and grace with which she transcribed hieroglyphs. On page 212 of the New England Magazine for April 1890, I introduced a facsimile of her manuscript that she had intended solely for my own eye. The characters are models of elegant drawing, yet I am sure that Miss Edwards executed them with a running hand. Some of my readers will pleasantly recall her electric manual touches upon the blackboard in her lecture upon the evolution of Egyptian letters and text. Another little brochure is on The Dispersion of Egyptian Antiquities, a paper read at the Leyden Congress. Still another at the Vienna Congress of 1886 on the same topic emphasizes the immense importance of obtaining some knowledge of the numerous private collections which are being thus rapidly enriched in Europe and America. The author ventures to think that many a lost chapter of Egyptian history might be recovered, at least in part, from the cabinets of wealthy amateurs. In 1888, Miss Edwards put forth a paper of valuable data on the provincial collections, such as the Peel Park Museum in Manchester and the Mayer Collection at Liverpool. Mr. R. N. Cust, at the Congress which met in 1889 at Stockholm and Christiania, presented her paper upon the Cypriot, Phoenician, and other signs upon the potsherds found by Mr. Petrie in the Fayum. The Times special correspondent, referring particularly to this paper, said, "The dates of which the characters assigned to the 12th and 18th dynasties have led to the conclusion that the Greco-Phoenician alphabet was in use in Egypt at a period antecedent to the date of the Exodus." On September 18, 1889, my friend wrote me from Richmond Villa at Weston-super-Mare in her usual frank vein of discourse as to what was doing and what she was about. "By this post I send you parts of 2 Times newspapers. I am not sure whether I did or did not send you the article I wrote on Mr. Petrie's closing work in the Fayum, July 20th. I therefore send a copy with the one on his exhibition published last Monday. The letter contains a brief reference to my paper written for the Stockholm Congress, which you may like to paragraph. I was the first person to identify the signs on Mr. Petrie's potsherds. His mother sent me his weekly letters all the time he was in Egypt. She always does so, and upon them I write my notices of his work in the Times. In one or two of these letters he gave facsimile sketches of the potsherds graffiti, and I sent him by next post numerous identifications of them, with Cypriot, Phoenician, Lycian, Theran, Phrygian, Etruscan, and other letters. I never told a living soul about it, and when Poole and all of them were talking of the wonderful rumors, I gravely kept silent, though I had seen and identified them. And they say a woman cannot keep a secret. Sayce visited Petrie in the Fayum weeks after and re-identified them precisely as I had done. There are over 60 Cypriot letters among them. It is the discovery of our day. The fact is, the subject is of extraordinary interest and importance. The American Geographical Society, in its bulletin of December 1890, published her paper on recent discoveries in Egypt, being, in part, her lecture before the Society in Chickering Hall, New York, and it also appeared in pamphlet form. Its discussion of Mr. Petrie's discoveries at Tel Gurub and Tel Kahun in the Fayum is based on her Stockholm treatise of that remarkable philological revelation. But two of Dr. Edwards' American Magazine articles will be referred to here. Harper's October 1886 contained The Story of Tanis, Zoan, which, as an archaeological paper in a popular magazine, is, as a whole, without its peer, at least in my humble opinion. Its background of study and research, its grouping of historical data and exploration details, its dignity and classic finish, its imaginative play, resting on ascertained conditions and established topography, in the portrayal of Zoan in all its glory when Ramses oppressed Israel, particularly in the description of the scene which a stranger approaching that great northern capital of the pharaohs would have witnessed, when the king of all colossi in Egypt and all the world towered in majesty above the vast temple. These and more stamp this article as a masterpiece of archaeological and historical verbal painting. And yet, in Bubastis, an historical study, the initial contribution to the Century for January 1890, there is an equally charming delineation of that marvelous discovery by Dr. Neville, king of hieroglyphics, albeit simpler told, and if anything more to the point. It is much in the style of her lectures. Indeed, Miss Edwards almost affected simplicity of style the last 2 or 3 years of her life. This may have been owing to her constant writing for the Times and the Academy, and particularly because of her latest vocation, that of a lecturer to popular audiences, when she became largely colloquial in her manner of speech. And that simple manner, combined with dignity of bearing, always took her listeners by storm. When the Funds volume on Goshen, that invaluable discovery, appeared, I suggested to my colleague that its style was too dry to produce the effect in the United States that I wished in influencing people to aid our work. "It should be more in your style," I believe I wrote. "Alas, I admit all that you say about Goshen. It is dry and too profound," she replied. "Yet how deeply interesting to us! I am astonished at the closeness of the reasoning, how ingenious and convincing it is, even to the identification of the water of Ra with the Heliopolitan spring. My dear friend, it is of no use to compare Naval's reports in the Academy with mine in the Times. You must remember that the Egyptologists do not write a picturesque and popular style like that of A.B.E., who has had 30 years of literary work in the Romantic school, and who has especially cultivated style, worked at it as if it was a science, and mastered it. I study style like a poet, calculating even the play of vowel sounds and the music of periods. Style is an instrument which I have practiced sedulously, and which I can play upon. But our Egyptologists, etc., what do they know of the subtle harmony? They have never flung themselves into the life and love of imaginary men and women. They have never studied the landscape painting of scenery in words. They have no notion of the art, the dexterity, the ear required for musical English. They have no time for such things. It is not their vocation. I am the only romancist in the world who is also an Egyptologist. We must not expect the owl of Athena to warble like the nightingale of Keats. Adieu, your devoted friend, A.B. Edwards. The Britannica Encyclopedia has some specimens of Miss Edwards' good workmanship in her adopted profession, and also a special article from her for the American edition on the recent discoveries in Egypt. Her series of papers on the question, "Was Ramses II the Pharaoh of the Oppression?" were, I believe, gathered into a sheaf, but I have never seen it. From the founding of our society till the last year of her life, she contributed occasionally to the Graphic and the Illustrated News, and regularly to the Times, articles upon our work in Egypt that were of the highest value to the cause. They were copied into our American newspapers, and I utilized them in various other ways. The loss of my associate to me, in this particular, is simply irreparable. From her I got the latest news, and by her personal letters I learned of the plans in advance of each season's campaign. Miss Edwards' more scholarly, but never abstruse or dry, journalistic contributions on Egypt appeared in the Academy. Says its editor, Mr. J.S. Cotton, of her work, "The Academy has suffered by her death an irreparable loss. During the past 15 years she must have contributed to our columns more than 100 articles, many of considerable length, and all requiring some research. We know not whether to admire in them most the brilliancy of their narrative style or the accuracy with which each detail was verified. She was, in truth, a model contributor, never declining a request, punctual to her promises, writing in a clear, bold hand, and considerate of the convenience of the printer as well as editor." I wish to press home the truthful remark of Mr. Cotton as to the accuracy of Miss Edwards' details or special statements based on research. The Saturday Review considers that her books are deserving of special praise for the small percentage of error they contain. In a New York weekly journal, The Epoch, of March 28, 1890, an anonymous correspondent, under the caption "Miss Amelia B. Edwards Blunders," made a wholesale onslaught on her lectures, charging her with being ignorant of her themes and abounding in gross misstatements. "All sheer bosh and nonsense" is one of his elegant applications to the lecture which treats of animal worship. I advise my readers to see this reviewer's contribution and the reply of Miss Edwards, through me, in the Epoch of June 6th. One citation will tell the tale. The reviewer said, "She made a great deal out of an old snatch of a threshing song, which she even mistranslated." He exclaimed, "Ye gods of Egypt, did ever such sounds offend your ears?" Miss Edwards' retort, so suggestive of fine thrashing qualities, is simple. "The translation which I gave of that song," Pharaohs, Fellahs, and Explorers, Lectures in the United States, pages 236 and 307, "was made expressly for this lecture by Mr. Lepage Renouf, keeper of the Egyptian Department in the British Museum and successor to Dr. Birch as president of the Society of Biblical Archaeology, whose profound and accurate knowledge of the structure and grammar of the ancient Egyptian language is unsurpassed. Mr. Charles Dudley Warner's pithy words in the July Harpers are a good peroration to our claim for her painstaking accuracy. She never wrote about anything she did not know." A letter of January 12, 1885, remarks as follows: "Most nights I have been at the desk till 2 and 3 a.m., and the Times article was a matter of the whole night long. My eyes are suffering, and I feel 10 years older than I did 3 weeks ago. Enough of self. Let me turn to your marvelous work in New York. Well, no one but yourself, I think, could have performed that feat of physical and mental and diplomatic achievement. And in the midst of it, you could actually sit down at the Astor House and write that lucid, compact, decisive, exhaustive article for the Churchman." The Churchman of December 28, 1884, on the site of the biblical Zoan, etc. "This is wonderful to me. I cannot write except in my own library, at my own desk, with everything to hand and perfect peace and quiet. If our old gardener whistles at his work, pruning or weeding in the vegetable garden behind my library, I have actually to send out to him to leave off. If the maids chatter in my hearing, I stop them. I suppose I am very strong, too, but my strength now is more fictitious than real, more nervous than solid. Yet not so very long ago I walked up the highest mountain in central France, 4 hours up and 3 hours down, and then declared myself ready to do it again if anybody liked to turn back with me. I could not do that now." These lines are now of peculiar interest. "I look now to Griffith and Petrie," she is referring to Englishmen, "to carry on the torch of Egyptian learning in the future, when Poole and I shall have passed away. My work will, I hope, in a sense, go on forever, in the limited sense of our forever, for I have made my will and left an endowment for a professorship of Egyptology to University College, London. I wish I could spare the money at once and see it working before I die, but that is impossible. They will have my Egyptian library, collection of antiquities, etc., etc. This is private. Another, dated November 16, 1885, contains these paragraphs. Your long and most interesting and very confidential letter delighted me. There are some parts which I should prefer not to destroy, as they relate to me, and tell me facts which I am very happy and humbly thankful to know. I mean as to the light in which my labors are viewed in America. I do work conscientiously. I never review a book, for instance, without carefully reading it, and I never put anything down as facts without having first gone to every reference on the subject, and when I am not positively sure of a thing, I always qualify my words with I think or I believe. If your people find me reliable, I rejoice that they are so convinced, because they do me justice, and it shows they know enough, I mean the general public, to discriminate on abstruse subjects between theorists and positivists. I am a positivist in science, and like the elephant I try the bridge with my trunk before I venture to cross it. But I fear they terribly overrate me in other ways. I am a very indifferent hieroglyphist. I have not time to work at text, as I did once. My energies are diverted into the practical grooves of Egyptology, that is, exploration, and the acquisition and analysis of all that is learned, discovered, and translated in whatever country and from whatever sources. I try to let nothing escape me, and perhaps, take me all round, I know more about Egyptian history and recent results than anybody else, but I am not a translator, and I fear now I never shall be. Had Miss Edwards' life been spared another decade, the world would have been the richer by at least 2 or 3 more new books of a caliber and merit equal to her Pharaohs, Fellahs, and Explorers, and my earnest hope is that her revision of Wilson's Egypt is about ready for the publisher, as it is the work on the history of the dynasties and marked epochs of Egypt for the general reader, and singularly useful for reference. Her translation of Maspero's Egyptian Archaeology gives to the English reader a most authoritative textbook on the architecture and art of the ancient Egyptians. But this translation, with notes, her volume of lectures, her 1,000 Miles Up the Nile, together with the brochures and magazine articles, reveals sufficiently to us the structure and compass of her mind, and its capacities of expression. Broad as is that mental structure, the ability to convey its knowledge intelligently, captivatingly to others, is almost phenomenal. Certainly so in the realm of archaeology. She could turn her searchlight power of discernment upon points of investigation or announce results, and then touch her conclusions with remarkably exact local colors and a felicitous polychrome. Shall I discriminate? Miss Edwards' genius belongs to the objective rather than the subjective school, and she assiduously cultivated her powers and tastes in the direction of objects rather than subjects of thought, or, if the latter, from without rather than from within. She splendidly illustrated what it is to see and think through the eye rather than through pure reason. I do not know indeed that she ever read Plato, Aristotle, Descartes, and Hamilton, and although she could aptly quote the immortal Dogberry and other Shakespearean characters, yet I think she enjoyed the wit more than the human philosophy of Shakespeare. She was searching, investigating, logical for a woman in her deductions. Witness her treatment of the Ka question. But she lacked at least in her novels that imperial philosophic element, the subjective insight and genius of creation which permeates and sways the Daniel Derondas that are given the world. Lord Brackenbury, so full of life, light, color, and abounding in suggestions to the imagination and eye, typifies, I think, the objective novel as distinctively as Middlemarch represents the subjective novel of our day. This may explain why some people fail to appreciate Miss Edwards' novels, who praise her as an archaeologist. But readers, novelists, archaeologists are not all alike, thank heaven, and my associate was not a Brugsch, a Neville, or a Maspero, or anyone else but herself. Among her novels are My Brother's Wife, 500,000 of Money, Miss Carew, Debenham's Vow, In the Days of My Youth, Monsieur Maurice, Hand in Glove. Miss Edwards, as she told me, was never satisfied with her earlier romances. She wrote an abridgment of French history, and her Outlines of English History is still a textbook in American schools. She was sui generis. She knew the whole field of Egyptology better than any man, and no one could approach her word power to describe the field on the side of history, art, and exploration. I pray for, but I never expect to see, another Edwards in the domain of Egyptology. The queenly title is hers. On November 7, 1889, was given in the Brooklyn Academy of Music Miss Edwards' initial lecture in America, the Reverend Dr. R.S. Storrs making an address of welcome on behalf of the large and distinguished audience of representative men and women of New York and Brooklyn. Up to the date of her departure for home on March 28th, she gave in all about 120 public lectures in various parts of the land, some of them under the auspices of such institutions as Yale, Princeton, Amherst, Columbia, the Universities of Michigan and Pennsylvania, the Peabody Institute of Baltimore, and the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. In Columbus, Ohio, she broke her left arm, but undaunted, she lectured that evening and fulfilled every appointment thereafter that had been made for her. It was over a year from that untoward accident before she recovered even a moderate use of that arm. The following facts illustrate her amazing pluck and endurance. Arriving in New York some 2 or 3 weeks after the accident, and being in much pain, the arm was reset. She then attended a luncheon party, followed by a small reception. The afternoon was devoted to the annual meeting of the Cirrhosis Club, where she was enrolled an honorary member and given a splendid banquet. At 8 o'clock she was at the Metropolitan Opera House to read a paper on the birth and growth of romantic fiction as illustrated in Egyptian literature. Of the 2 other speakers on cognate topics, one took exception to her claim of the Egyptian origin of such and such and so and so. It was a meeting of the 19th Century Club, of freelance proclivities and practices. Although past 10 o'clock and insufferably hot, Miss Edwards, in an offhand but unhesitatingly clear, fluent, forcible, humorous speech of about 20 minutes' length, completely carried her audience with her. So at least the Tribune said, and it was my own impression. As the memorial minutes of the committee in England of the fund truly say of Miss Edwards' lectures, on both sides of the Atlantic she has made Egyptology a household word, representing a new intellectual interest. No single achievement of my life is more gratifying to me than my successful effort to induce my friend to visit the United States. The invitation was a fitting avant-coureur to the welcome and success that everywhere were hers. Having written over 200 personal notes to representative men and women in every department of life and work, I put out a leaflet on March 1, 1889, upon her capacities to lecture and her topics, to which I appended the following invitation, signed by Whittier, Lowell, Holmes, Curtis, Warner, Parkman, Booth, Vanderbilt, Morton, Storrs, the editors of Harper's The Century, The Atlantic, Scribner's, The Nation, The Critic, The Literary World, about all the leading university and college presidents, etc., some 200 names in all. The proposed visit of Miss Amelia B. Edwards to the United States to see our country and to lecture upon subjects in which she is an acknowledged authority, if carried into effect, will be an event of special interest to the intelligent and cultivated people of our land. She may be assured of a hearty welcome, and her lectures cannot fail to prove of rare profit and pleasure to her audiences. What I predicted, having in mind her lectures in Great Britain, was abundantly confirmed by her tour. The picturesqueness of her style, the interest of her facts, and the sympathetic charm of her delivery have evoked unwonted enthusiasm. Her voice is peculiarly clear, agreeable, and far-reaching, and she possesses, in a remarkable degree, the power of holding her audiences. Herself a practical archaeologist, she relates the wonders of our inheritance in ancient Egypt and the stirring story of Egyptian exploration with an intelligent vividness which makes those faraway subjects as interesting as a sensational romance. Herself a skillful artist, she can, in an instant, deftly illustrate with chalk some hieroglyphic puzzle or curious relationship between Egyptian and Greek arts. Miss Edwards, on August 30, 1889, wrote me of my preparations on her behalf. As you know, I never lectured in my life till November 3, 1887, and then only because Mr. Horsfall, who was on the corporation committee, insisted on it that I could, should, and must do it. It would never have entered into my head to attempt such a thing had he not done this. I attribute my success in lecturing to the training my voice had in youth, for I was a good singer. I could have taken to opera singing had I wished to earn my bread and fame in that way. My voice was of extraordinary compass and flexibility. Also, I had considerable taste for acting, and played a good deal in amateur theatricals when a girl, between 15 and 20. I think these last experiences have probably much to do with that clearness of utterance, etc., which are essential to successful lecturing. But I should like the American world to understand that I do none of these things now, nor have done them for the last 30 years. I am a very staid, quiet, hard-working body now. The Egypt Exploration Fund owed an unpayable debt to Miss Edwards. That debt is now due, will be ever due to her memory. Miss Edwards, as the obituary in the annual report of the fund says, has followed Erasmus Wilson and James Russell Lowell. Mr. Lowell was the honorary vice president of the society. His successor was George William Curtis. In honor of their memory, we, who survive, have a sacred duty to the great enterprise consecrated by their names. It may be truly added that the archaeological bread she cast upon the waters returned to her not after many days. Her position as honorary secretary of our society and the discoveries in progress afforded her a unique opportunity, which she splendidly utilized, of depicting to our age old Egypt as touched by the transforming wand of exploration. By that opportunity she gained a scientific as well as an official status. Her doctorates from Columbia, Smith, and Bethany colleges, LHD, LLD, and PhD, were owing to it. Because of it, she lectured in Great Britain, followed by an every way successful tour in the United States. It was the sine qua non of her best journalistic and magazine articles. Such an opportunity led up to the throne of Egyptology, upon which this sketch crowns her queen. And in short, it is through the society and her official position, and owing to the past decade of discoveries, that she won enduring fame. While we mourn her untimely call from the high mission she so grandly performed in the promotion of discovery and in the diffusion of knowledge acquired by it, we are profoundly thankful for the much that she lived to accomplish. May I add that through her personal efforts or influence, a large share of the funds from Great Britain were raised for our work, and that my lamented associate was a constant inspiration to me in my literary and financial efforts to advance our cause in the United States? The Archaeological Survey of Egypt, advocated by Mr. F. L. Griffith, now its superintendent, was greatly promoted by Dr. Edwards. In October last, she edited a special extra report of the survey, in order, as she wrote me, to create or increase an interest in it. Her last official act was to issue in November a 4-page circular respecting the claims and results of the survey. Her last important word to me, dated December 1st, was a 9-page letter, mostly relating to the Vicomte de Rouge's acceptance of the results of the fund's discoveries at the sites of Pithom, Goshen, etc., as contained in his recently published work, Géographie ancienne de la Basse Égypte. The cause of this able communication to me from Miss Edwards was a sublimely impertinent letter, addressed to the Society by a notorious dabbler in Egyptology, who relocates established sites and charges the great scholars and explorers with ignorance of the subject. He relies, as she remarks, on the little that is known and read in America on Egyptian subjects, and on his own colossal effrontery to carry him through. Here ends my sketch. The rest is silence? Not so. Intellectual culture, education, may everywhere regard Miss Edwards as a generous creditor in the great exchange of knowledge. For out of Egypt has chiefly come our knowledge of the evolution of man during a period of 5,000 years B.C., and among the delightful surprises of our day is the enthusiasm, intelligence, skill, magnetism, and poetry with which her pen and voice have invested the old subject, now regenerated to notice, public notice, by discovery and by portrayal like hers. May other imaginative and scholarly souls take up the burden of her song in the promotion of exploration to reveal and to record monumental history by the sweet waters of the Nile. End of The Queen of Egyptology by William Copley Winslow.
Religious Education by Immanuel Kant. From Edward Franklin Buchner's 1908 translation of Kant's 1803 lecture notes on pedagogy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. When we come to consider the religious education of children, the first question is whether it is possible to inculcate religious ideas upon young children. This is a point in pedagogy over which there has been much dispute. The concepts of religion always presuppose a theology. Now, would it be possible to teach a theology to young people who, far from having a knowledge of the world, do not know even themselves? Would youth, which does not yet know what duty is, be capable of comprehending an immediate duty to God? This much is certain, that if it were possible so to arrange that children should witness no act of adoration towards the Supreme Being, and that they should not even hear the name of God, the proper order of proceeding would be to lead their attention first to final causes and to that which is fitting for man, to exercise their judgment, to instruct them in the order and beauty of the works of nature, then to add an extended knowledge of the structure of the universe, and finally to reveal to them the idea of a Supreme Being, a lawgiver. But since this is not possible in the present state of society, the result would be, if one desired not to teach them anything about God until later, and yet they heard his name mentioned and saw demonstrations of devotion to him, that this would produce in them either indifference or perverted ideas, as, for example, fear of divine power. Now, since it is necessary to prevent this idea from nestling in the fantasy of children, the inculcation of religious concepts must be attempted very early. But this should not be an affair of memory, imitation, and pure mimicry, but the way which one selects must always be in harmony with nature. Children will comprehend, even without having the abstract concepts of duty, of obligations, of good or evil conduct, that there is a law of duty, that it is not the agreeable, the useful, and the like, which determine it, but something universal, which does not adjust itself according to the fancies of men. But the teacher himself must develop this concept. At first everything should be attributed to nature, and then nature itself attributed to God. How, for example, in the first place, everything was arranged for the conservation of the species and their equilibrium, but also remotely for man, that he be able to make himself happy. The best means for first making clear the idea of God is to employ the analogy of a father, under whose care we are placed. From this the transition to the idea of the unity of man, as in a family, can happily be made. But then, what is religion? Religion is the law in us, in so far as it is imprinted upon us by a legislator and a judge. It is morality applied to the knowledge of God. If religion is not united with morality, it becomes nothing more than an endeavor to gain divine favor. The singing of praises, prayers, and church going should only serve to give man new strength and new courage for improvement, or be the expression of a heart inspired by the idea of duty. These things are only preparations for good works, but not good works themselves, and one cannot please the Supreme Being otherwise than by becoming a better person. With the child it is necessary to commence with the law which he has in himself. Man is contemptible in his own eyes when he is vicious. This contempt springs from his own nature, and not from the fact that God has forbidden evil, for the legislator is not necessarily the author of the law. Thus a prince can forbid thievery without being regarded on this account as the author of the prohibition of theft. From this man learns to understand that his good conduct alone makes him worthy of blessedness. The divine law must appear at the same time as the natural law, for it is not arbitrary. Religion, therefore, is a part of all morality. But one must not begin with theology. That religion which is founded merely upon theology can never contain anything moral. There will arise from it only fear, on the one hand, and selfish purposes and sentiments on the other, which will produce nothing more than a superstitious cult. Morality must precede, theology follow, and then we have religion. The law in us is called conscience. Conscience is, properly speaking, the application of our actions to this law. The reproaches of conscience will be without effect if it be not considered as the representative of God, who has his lofty seat above us, but who has also established a tribunal in us. On the other hand, if religion is not joined with a moral conscientiousness, it is without effect. Religion without moral conscientiousness is a superstitious worship. People imagine that they serve God when, for example, they praise him and extol his power and his wisdom, without thinking how they can fulfill the divine laws. Yes, without even knowing and searching out his power and his wisdom, etc. These praises are an opiate for the conscience of such people, and a pillow on which they hope to sleep tranquilly. Children cannot comprehend all religious concepts, but a few, notwithstanding, must be imparted to them, only these should be more negative than positive. To make children repeat formulas is of no use, and produces only a false concept of piety. True reverence consists in acting according to God's will, and it is this that children must be taught. Care must be taken with children, as with oneself, that the name of God be not so often misused. Merely to use it in congratulation, even with pious intentions, is a profanation. The thought of God should fill man with reverence every time he speaks his name, and he should therefore seldom use it, and never frivolously. The child must learn to feel respect for God as the master of his life and of the whole world, further, as the protector of man, and finally as his judge. It is said that Newton always stopped and meditated a moment whenever he spoke the name of God. By a unified elucidation of the concepts of God and of duty, the child learns all the better to respect the care which God takes for his creatures, and is thus restrained from the inclination for destruction and cruelty, which expresses itself so much in the torture of small animals. At the same time, youth should be taught to discover the good in evil. For example, animals of prey and insects are models of cleanliness and industry. Wicked men make us think of the law. Birds which seek worms are protectors of the garden, etc. One should also give children some concepts of the Supreme Being, so that whenever they see others pray, etc., they may know to whom they are praying, and why they do it. But these concepts should be few in number, and, as already said, only negative. One should, however, begin to inculcate these in the earliest years, but at the same time guard against children estimating men according to their religious practices. For, in spite of its varieties, there is, after all, everywhere unity of religion. End of Religious Education by Immanuel Kant. From Edward Franklin Buchner's 1908 translation of Kant's 1803 lecture notes on pedagogy.
Tuptim, A Tragedy of the Harem by Harriet Leonowens. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Matt Ferrard. Tuptim, A Tragedy of the Harem by Harriet Leonowens. Those of my readers who may recur to my late work, The English Governess at the Siamese Court, will find on the 265th page mention of a young girl of fresh and striking beauty, and delightful piquancy of ways and expression, who, with a clumsy club, was pounding fragments of pottery, urns, vases, and goblets for the foundation of the Wat, or temple, Raja Ba Ditsan. Very artless and happy she seemed, and as free as she was lovely. But the instant she perceived that she had attracted the notice of the king, who presided at the laying of the foundation of the temple, and flung gold and silver coins among the workwomen, she sank down and hid her face in the earth, forgetting or disregarding the falling vessels that threatened to crush her. But the king merely diverted himself with inquiring her name and parentage, and someone answering for her, he turned away. This is all that is there said of her. A week later I saw the girl again, as I was passing through the long enclosed corridor within the palace, on my way to my schoolroom in the temple. She was lying prostrate on the marble pavement among the offerings which were placed there for the king's acceptance, and which he would inspect in his leisurely progress towards his breakfast hall. I never went that way without seeing something lying there: bales of silk on silver trays, boxes of tea, calicoes, velvets, fans, priests' robes, precious spices, silver, gold, and curiosities of all kinds: in fact, almost anything and everything that money could purchase, or the most abject sycophancy could imagine as likely to gratify the despot. Every noble, prince, and merchant sought to obtain the royal favor by gifts thus presented, it being fully understood between the giver and receiver that whoever gave the most costly presents should receive the largest share of royal patronage and support. But the most precious things ever laid upon the pavement were the young hearts of women and children. Two women were crouching on either side of the young girl, waiting for the entrance of the king, in order to present her to him. I was hardly surprised to see her there. I had grown accustomed to such sights, but I was surprised at the unusual interest she appeared to excite in the other women present, who were all whispering and talking together about her, and expressing their admiration of her beauty in the most extravagant language. She was certainly very beautiful by nature, and those who sent her there had exhausted all the resources of art to complete, according to their notions, what nature had begun, and to render her a fitter offering for the king. Her lips were dyed a deep crimson by the use of betel, her dark eyebrows were continued in indigo until they met on her brow, her eyelashes were stained with kohl, the tips of her fingers and her nails were made pink with henna, while enormous gold chains and rings bedizened her person. Already too much saddened by the frequency of such sights, I merely cast a passing glance upon her and went my way. But now, as I see in memory that tiny figure lying there, and the almost glorified form in which I beheld it for the last time, I cannot keep the tears from my eyes, nor still the aching of my heart. About 3 months or so later we met again in the same place. I was passing through to the schoolroom when I saw her joyously exhibiting to her companions a pomegranate which she held in her hand. It seemed to be the largest and finest fruit of the kind I had ever seen, and I stopped to get a closer view both of the girl and of the fruit. each perfect in its kind. I found, however, that the fruit was not real, only an imitation. It was a casket of pure gold, the lids of which were inlaid with rubies which looked exactly like the seeds of the pomegranate when ripe. It was made to open and shut at the touch of a small spring, and was most exquisitely moulded into the shape and enamelled with the tints of the pomegranate. It was her betel box. "Where did you get this box?" I inquired. She turned to me with a child's smile upon her face, pointed to the lofty chamber of the king, and said, "My name, you know, is Tuptim (pomegranate)." I understood the gift. Afterwards I saw her frequently. On one occasion she was crying bitterly, while the head wife, Thing, was reproving her with unusual warmth for some fault. I interrupted Thing to ask for some paper and ink for the schoolroom, but she paid no attention to my demands. Instead of complying with them at once, as usual, she inquired of me, "What shall I do with this Tuptim? She is very disobedient. Shall I whip her, or starve her till she minds?" "Forgive her, and be good to her," I whispered in Thieng's ear. "What?" said the offended lady in an angry tone. "When she does wrong all the time and is so naughty and wilful? Why, when she is ordered to remain upstairs she runs away and hides herself in Maprang's or Simlah's rooms, and we are taken to task by his Majesty, who accuses us of jealousy and unkind treatment towards her. Then we have to search all the houses of the Chongs (concubines) until we find her, either in hiding or asleep, and bring her to him. The moment she comes into his presence she goes down upon her knees, appearing so very bashful and innocent that he is enraptured at the sight, and declares that she is the most perfect, the most fascinating of women. But as soon as she can get away she does the same thing again, only finding some new hiding place, and so she makes an infinity of trouble. Now she says she is ill and cannot wait upon the king, while the physicians declare that there is nothing whatever the matter with her. I really don't know what to do or what to say, for I don't dare to tell the truth to the king, and I'm in constant fear that she will come to a bad end, if she doesn't follow my advice and make up her mind to bear her life here more patiently. I pity the poor girl, who really looked either sick or unhappy. Child as she was, there was a great deal of quiet dignity about her, as, with eyes filled with tears, she protested that she was utterly sick at heart, and could not go upstairs any more. I was sure that Thing's sweeping reproof did not indicate any malice or real anger towards the girl, and, putting my arms around the elder lady, I succeeded in soothing her indignation, and at length obtained permission for Tuptim to be absent from duty for a few days. A grateful smile lit up the girl's tearful face as she crept away. "That girl is too artless," said kind hearted Thing to me, as soon as the child was out of sight, "and she will not even try to like her life here. I pity her from my very heart, ma'am dear, but it would not do to show it. She would take advantage of my kindness, and keep away from the king altogether, as Martian does, and in all such cases we head wives have to bear the brunt of the king's displeasure, and are thought to be jealous and intriguing, when the holy Buddha in heaven knows that there is only kindness in our hearts." Not long after the above conversation, Tuptim began to come to school. She wanted to learn to write her name in English, she said, and she came to me once or twice a week until she had acquired that accomplishment, which seemed to give her immense satisfaction. After she had done this, she asked me if I would write the name Kun P'hra Bala for her in English. I wrote it for her at once, without asking her why she wanted it or whose name it was. I did not even know if it was the name of a man or a woman, as the Siamese have no masculine and feminine terminations to their names and titles. She immediately began to trace the letters for herself, and I could see a world of tenderness in her large, dreamy eyes as she copied and recopied the name in its English characters. I cannot rightly remember how often or how long she came to the school, for she was but one among many. but whenever she found me engaged with the princes and princesses, she would sit for hours on the marble floor, and listen to our simple exercises of translating English into Siamese, or Siamese into English, with increasing interest and delight expressed in her pure, guileless face. I do remember that she was never alone, but always accompanied by 2 or 3 young companions of about her own age, who were as listless and idle as she was absorbed and interested. Perhaps this was the reason, with her extreme youth, for she was still but a child, and seemed even younger than she really was, why I never attempted to enter into conversation with her, or to learn anything about her history and her feelings. If I had done this, I might have succeeded in winning her confidence, and perhaps have been the means of reconciling her to her life in the palace. That I did not will ever be a source of poignant regret to me. One afternoon, as I was about leaving the palace after school, she came running up to me, took a scrap of paper from under her vest, and held it silently before my eyes, while I read what was written upon it. It was the name Khoon P'hra Bâlât, carefully written in English characters, and she seemed delighted with the praise I bestowed on the writing. "Whose name is it, Tuptim?" I asked. She cast down her eyes and hesitated for a moment. Then, raising them to mine, she replied, "It is the name of the favorite disciple of the high priest, Chow Khoon Sah. He lives at the temple of Raja Ba Dit Sang, and sometimes preaches to us in the palace." The expression of deep reverence that animated her face as she spoke revealed to me a new phase in her character, and I felt strongly attracted towards her. I nevertheless left the palace without further conversation, but, on my way home, formed a vague resolution that I would endeavour to become better acquainted with her, and attempt to win her confidence. My half formed resolve was without result, however, since, for some reason unknown to me, she never came to the schoolroom again; and, as I did not chance to meet her on my visits to the palace, she soon passed from my thoughts, and I forgot all about her. Some 9 months, or perhaps a year, after my last encounter with Tuptim, I became conscious of a change in the demeanour of my elder pupils. They were abstracted, and appeared desirous to get away from their studies as soon as possible. It seemed as if there were some secret they had been ordered to conceal from my boy and me. My imagination immediately took the alarm, and I became possessed with the idea that some grave calamity was impending. One day, when breaking up school for the afternoon, I heard one of the princes say to the others in Siamese, "Come, let's go and hunt for Tuptim." "Why, where has she gone?" As soon as I asked the question, Princess Yonwalax angrily seized him by the arm and hurried him away. I had no wish to inquire further. What I had heard was enough to excite my imagination afresh, and I hurried home full of anxiety about poor little Tuptim, thus suddenly brought back to my remembrance. On the following evening, it being Sunday, one of my servants informed me that a slave girl from the palace wished to speak with me in private. When she came in, her face seemed familiar, but I could not remember where I had seen her, or whose slave she was. She crawled up close to my chair, and told me in a low voice that her mistress, Khoon Chow Tuptim, had sent her to me. "You know," she added, "that my mistress has been found." "Found!" I exclaimed. "What do you mean?" She repeated my question, and in great astonishment asked, "Why, did you not know that my mistress had disappeared from the palace? That his Majesty had offered a reward of 20 catties (about $1,500) to any one who would bring any information about her, and that no trace of her could be discovered, though everybody had been searching for her far and near?" "No, I have never heard a word about it. But how could she have got out of the palace through the 3 rows of gates that are always bolted, and not be seen by the Amazons on guard?" "Alas, my lady, she did get out," replied the girl, who looked very wan and weary, whose eyes seemed to have been shedding tears for a long time, and who was on the point of breaking down again. She then went on to tell me that 2 priests had that morning discovered her mistress in the monastery attached to the temple of Raja Ba Dit Sang, and had brought the information to the king, by whose order she had been arrested and imprisoned in one of the palace dungeons. "But what good can I do, Phim?" I asked sorrowfully. "Oh, ma'am dear, if you don't help her, she's lost, she'll be killed!" cried the girl, bursting into a passion of tears. "Oh, do go to the king and ask him to forgive her. He'll grant her life to you. I'm sure he will. Oh, what shall I do? I've nobody to go to but you, and there's nobody but you can help her." And her tears and sobs were truly heartrending. I tried to soothe her. "Tell me, Phim," I said, "why did your mistress leave the palace, and who helped her to get away?" The girl would not answer my question, but kept repeating, "Oh, do come and see her yourself! Do come and see her yourself! You can go to the palace after dark, and the gatekeepers will let you in. Nobody need know that you are going to see my dear mistress." As there was no other method of quieting the poor girl, I finally made the promise, though I did not see what good my going could do, and was fully convinced that Phim had abetted Tuptim in her wrongdoing, whatever that might have been. After the slave girl had left me, I sat by my window and watched the stars as they came out, one by one, and shone with unusual splendor in the cloudless sky. It was a lovely night, and I felt the soothing influence of the Christian Sabbath even in that pagan land. But the one idea that took possession of my mind was, poor little Tuptim, in that dreadful dungeon underground. Still, and notwithstanding my promise, I felt a strong reluctance to respond to the cry which had reached me from her, and wished that I had never heard it. I was tired of the palace, tired of witnessing wrongs I could not remedy, and half afraid, too, to enter that weird, mysterious prison world after nightfall. So I sat still in dreamy uncertainty, till a warm hand was laid upon mine, and I turned my eyes from the stars above to the poor slave girl's sad, tear stained face at my feet. "The gates are open for the Prime Minister, ma'am dear," said she, in a low, pleading voice, "and you can get in now without any difficulty." I rose at once, resolutely cast my cowardly fears behind me, told my boy where and why I was going, put 20 ticals in my purse, wrapped my black cloak about me, and hurried towards the palace gate. Phim had run back at once, for fear of being shut out for the night. The women at the gates, who were all friendly to me, admitted me without question, and, as I passed, I dropped 2 ticals into the hand of the chief of the Amazons on guard, saying that I had been called into the palace on important business, and begging her to keep the inner gates open for my return. "You must be sure and come back before it strikes 11," said she, and I passed on. As soon as I entered the main street within the walls, the slave girl joined me, and led the way, crouching and running along in the deep shadow of the houses, until we reached the gate of the prison in which Tuptim was immured, when she immediately disappeared. The hall I entered was immense, with innumerable pillars, and a floor which seemed to be entirely made up of huge trap doors, double barred and locked, while the lanterns by which it was dimly lighted were hung so high that they looked like distant stars. There were about a dozen Amazons on guard, some of whom were already stretched in sleep on their mats and leather pillows, their weapons lying within reach. The eyes of all the wakeful custodians of the prison were fixed upon me as I entered. A courteous return was made to my polite salutation, and Ma Ying Taphan, Great Mother of War, addressed me kindly, inquiring what was my object in coming there at that time of night. I told her that I had just heard of Tuptim's having got into trouble and being imprisoned, and had come to ascertain if I could be of any assistance to her. "The child is in trouble indeed," replied Ma Ying Taphan, "and has not only got herself into prison, but her 2 young friends, Mapran and Simla, who are confined with her." "Can I not help them in any way?" I asked. "No," said the Amazon gently, "I fear you cannot. Her guilt is too great, and she must take the consequences." "What has she been doing?" To this question I could get no answer, and after vainly attempting to persuade Ma Ying Taphan to tell me, I tried to induce her to let me go down and visit poor Tuptim. "My, impossible. was the reply, "without an express order from the king. When you bring us that, we will let you in, but without it we cannot." And mind was the only answer I could get to my repeated and urgent entreaties. I sat there, hopelessly looking at the Amazons, who, in the dim light of the distant lanterns overhead, seemed to me to be changed from tender hearted women, as they were, into fierce, vindictive executioners, and at the huge trap door at our feet, beneath which the three children, as the Amazon had rightly called them, were imprisoned, but from which no sound, no cry, no indication of life escaped, until, tired and despairing, I rose and left the palace. As soon as I was out of the building I saw Femme, the slave girl, crouching in the shadows on the opposite side of the street, and keeping pace with me as I went towards the palace gate. When I turned into another street she joined me, and I found that she had been hidden under the portico of the prison, and had heard all my conversation with the Amazons. Prostrating herself till her forehead touched my feet, she implored me, in the name of the P'hra Chow in heaven, not to forsake her dear mistress. "She is to be brought before the court in the outside hall of justice to morrow," she said. "Oh, do come early! Perhaps you can persuade Khoon Thow App to be merciful to her." And with a sickening sense of my utter powerlessness, I promised to be present at the trial. End of Tuptim, A Tragedy of the Harem, by Anna Harriet Leonowens.